All right, welcome, Darby Schaaf. How are you?
Hi, I'm good. How you doing, Pete? It's a lovely day outside, so we picked the right time to be inside doing
That's
a
right.
Zoom interview today.
That's right. On one of the most beautiful days of the year. Um, how's it feel now, looking back, reflecting back on? It's been 3 years since the Grand Wall tweet, almost. It's been 2 years since we saved the crew, October 12th. Um, is it surreal looking back on it? Is it, how do you have perspective on it now?
Oh, I think it's definitely surreal. This was a thing that when we were engaged in this process, we were so focused on each moment, each action, each task that needed to be done that we couldn't really see the larger picture sometimes. We weren't seeing the forest for the trees, but now that it's all past us, and even in this weird world that we're in, where it's something resembling normalcy when it comes to our team, and we can kind of take a step back. I think it's kind of wild that there was something I was thinking about the other day that just when you say a phrase like this is something that has never been done in the history of American sports, how huge that is. America has a pretty significant and broad sports world, and to be able to be a small part of something that has literally never happened before is pretty incredible to think about. Most of us don't ever expect to be a part of something like that.
Yeah. One thing we've talked about in terms of your personality is that you're kind of a devil's advocate. You're not necessarily an optimist, and the crew. When I say crew, the gang of 19, right? The leadership team.
Mhm.
I mean, you had to stay in this game for a year. You didn't know how long it was going to take, but it took almost a year. And so, how did that play with the other members in terms of, like, were you a voice of reason? Were how did you balance all of that?
Yeah, I think so. One of the strengths of our group was the variety of perspectives and voices. We had people who were experts in their field and people who really knew their shit. And one challenge with that can sometimes be you just assume that person always has the right or best idea for their area of specialty. Um, and sometimes you need that, the voice of just other normal people to kind of balance things out. A lot of our more momentous sort of tasks or approaches that we used, we would have a group vote, and depending upon sort of the level of importance, it would affect whether you needed, a simple majority or like a super majority kind of thing. um, but I remember on a couple of occasions where I was literally the sole voice of dissent. Um, and I was fine with that. And even if, nobody else agrees with what I'm saying, I think there's a value in just providing that
Mhm.
other approach. I wasn't ever trying to be obstinate or difficult. It was just here's another thing to think about before we just rush headlong into this thing. And I think having those voices is definitely a benefit in a movement like this. We were all about having a number of voices. Everybody
Mhm.
needed to be heard in this.
And that's one of the great characteristics of the leadership team, is that um, there were no there was never a case where somebody couldn't voice their opinion, and nothing was ever held personally against somebody, or egos didn't get in the way. So you were free to, you didn't feel like, I got to go along with this group. Your role was to be honest, and everybody's role was to be honest, right?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, there were very rarely, I would say, unanimous agreements in
Mhm.
a lot of the things we were doing. But at the end of the day, we all knew we were going after the same goal, and we all
Mhm.
had the right reasons for doing so. So even if you're a little, miffed that your self-perceived brilliant idea gets shot down, at the end of the day, these people are still going to have your back. They
Yeah.
still love you and support you, and they're fighting for the same thing that you are.
Yeah. Now, you talked about, all the skill sets that came to the group, and your role was to vet a lot of that. You were given what's been described as the shittiest job, which was to, early on, when dozens and dozens and dozens of emails and tweets and DMs and contacts came your way, Save the Crew's way, uh, there was a recognition that, boy, we need somebody who's analytical and somebody who's a good organizer and somebody with good judgment to monitor all this, to have everything come through him, which turns out to be Darby. And you took on that job, and you vetted hundreds of uh, requests or ideas, or just people jumping in saying, "What can I do to help?"
Sure. Yeah. Handling the voices coming in to us was absolutely a full-time job in this process, and something, while they said it was the shittiest job, and they told me that up front, it was a really important thing to do. There were so many people who had thoughts and ideas and suggestions and questions, and those all had to be dealt with, and they had to be responded to. I served sort of a triage function. I tried not to be too much of a gatekeeper because I knew it was important to consider a lot of these things, and even some of the more out there ideas that people might have had. It's not for me to judge and say that that's the wrong thing, but it was getting that message then to the right part of the leadership group. Making sure that, okay, this is more of a business thing, so let's make sure Donnie sees it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I didn't. It's also important in that time to make sure that you're responding to everybody who's offering this up respectfully, because that was something we had been lacking with our ownership, was not being taken seriously and not being listened to. And we needed this to be a community thing where everybody felt respected and valued, so that they'd be a part of this. If they send me an idea and I reply with like, oh, that's that's great, thanks, we'll consider it, bye. Somebody who gets that message back they're not going to feel encouraged, they're not going to feel validated, and they might not be as interested in supporting what you're doing and being a part of it if you're not making them feel heard.
Yeah, which really would work against the entire ethos of your effort, which was to mobilize an entire community. And so you really had to be really careful not to alienate anyone, right?
Yeah, and there were a lot of great people and a lot of great ideas that came through those methods of communication. I mean, a couple of our members of our leadership team initially reached out by email, and so we'd say, okay, come to Endeavor, where to the watch party, and we'll meet up with you and we'll talk and stuff. And I remember getting emails from Tim Myers and David Miller early on, who later became really key members of the team.
Yeah.
But yeah, just taking all of those offers of help, and sometimes we had some overlap. We did have a number of people who were very social media oriented people who wanted to help kind of handle that aspect, and figuring out ways where maybe we could incorporate them, even though we already had sort of a key structure set up. Well, maybe there are other ways that they can help or be useful. So just making sure that we never ruled anybody out or anything out of hand.
One of the amazing things of the leadership team is that you've got such a broad spectrum of skill sets that all together really do create a business. Creates an organization where you've got from legal to research to design to writing to create creative direction to media relations to analytical skills to merchandising to spokesperson, all of that. And a lot of that you had to pass some judgment on in terms of like, for example, when David Miller writes you and says, hey, I've got some skills I think could be valuable, you recognized, that's an area where we need. And you invite him in. You didn't invite everybody in, right? So
sure,
you did have to pass judgment. I mean, not a gatekeeper, but you had to have really good instinct, is how I would phrase it, in terms of what kinds of needs you would have as a group, and then what might be something you need down the road. And like Keith and Tim joined the team well down the road, but wow, were they ever valuable?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I think it's important in this kind of situation to recognize where the gaps are
Mhm.
in your organization and your structure. We had sort of built up the social media, for example, when David reached out, and his email specified like he was all about uh, like I guess you call it traditional media. I mean, he had connections to people at in the newspaper and at the television stations, and is good at press release kinds of things. That was an area that maybe we could have kind of made work on our own, but having somebody who has that specific skill sets, he was infinitely better than something we could have cobbled together without him.
Yeah, right. Is there any skill set looking back that you wish you would have had that you didn't bring onto the team, or?
Hmm. Gosh, I don't. Over time, we did really develop a very strong team. I think, in fact, if something like this, God forbid, ever happens to another team, I would like to think we've given them a pretty good
Mhm.
template to work with. I
Right.
think every situation is probably going to be a little different, but we really did hit a lot of the things that we needed to hit, um, and happily sometimes pieces just fell into our lap. I mean, Andrew King being sort of the legal
Mhm.
expert of the team wasn't something we necessarily sought out very much. I think probably in part because we knew there could be an expense associated with it. You really need, unfortunately, people who are willing and able to volunteer their times in this kind of thing. If we'd had to pay people for their services, uh, it probably would have been a lot more challenging movement. But no, I think we had all the right people at exactly the
Mhm.
right time, which is fantastic and was a huge benefit to us.
Yeah, great. Well, you sure assembled a great team, and that goes without saying. So, thank you, Darby. Appreciate your
Oh,
time today.
absolutely. Thank you so much.
Cheers.